As the principal at Burleigh Law LLC, John brings a well-grounded knowledge of Washington law, a unique legal perspective, and a highly relational approach to his advocacy for his clients. He is an active member of WSCAI, a regular contributor to the WSCAI monthly publication, and a frequent speaker at events regarding matters affecting associations in Washington. A 2006 graduate of Gonzaga University School of Law, Mr. Burleigh is a member of the State Bar of Washington. John and his wife, Annie, are the blessed parents of 4 children, ages high school to 4 years old, bless his heart, and are actively involved in the Puget Sound. Thanks, John, for being here.
All right, thanks, Kim. I really appreciate that, and appreciate the opportunity to present today. It's great to be back virtually with everybody and see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm really excited about the topic today. Can everybody see the screen? I think we've done this right. You can see the PowerPoint that's being shared. See some nods. Good. Okay, that's good. So I've been asked to present today. I'm going to present on kind of a 101 on community associations. And so I know we have some of you who've been managing for many years. We probably have some who've been managing maybe for a very short time. And hopefully this the presentation today serves all of you. But it really is aimed, I would say, at those who are new to this arena and are kind of just trying to get your arms around all the different things to be thinking about and to know in managing a community association. So I've kind of likened it. I've got a friend who's a seaplane pilot, and she likes to take us up and fly around Seattle or around Gig Harbor where I live. And you know, the view is just so different when you're up above. And so as you're looking down, everything just seems so orderly, and you can see the nice little neighborhoods, and you don't really realize that in that one house down there, there's the crazy guy that is making your life so difficult. But from up above, you get to see the whole thing, and it just looks really nice and orderly. And so that's a little bit of the approach we're going to take today to community associations, and just look at it. Each one of the topics I'm going to touch on today really could be an entire presentation. And for those of you that have been around for a while, you probably have heard a presentation on all of these topics. But we're going to go through them kind of at breakneck speed. And so I'll take questions at the end, but it's going to feel a little bit like the fire hose. You're drinking from a fire hose today in terms of the volume of information. Because again, I'm just going to try to touch on a lot of the key points, big picture that are applicable here for management of a community association and what you need to know. So hopefully it doesn't feel like this, but and that's my goal, is to walk it through clearly, but to touch on as much as we possibly can here in this hour. So when you're managing a community association, we really have 2 buckets when we start. One is it a condominium? If it's not, it's something else. It's an HOA. HOA is really kind of the catch-all bucket. And so the first question you would ask as you take on a community is, am I dealing with a condominium or an HOA, a homeowners association? How do we know if it's a condominium? A condominium generally is where you have portions of the real estate designated for separate ownership. That's the units. The individual lives in the unit. And then the remainder is called the common elements. And those are designated for common ownership in, here's the key words, undivided fractional shares by the unit owners. So in a condominium, you know it's a condominium if it's divided between units and common elements. And we know that sometimes the common elements are further divided into limited common elements. Most often they are. But the owners, if there's 10 owners in the condominium, they have undivided fractional shares. It may be equal shares. It may be shares that are divvied up by different percentages based on different factors, usually how big their unit is, or something else, but ultimately they all have an undivided fractional share ownership in all of the common elements. And usually those common elements include the exterior of the buildings, maybe a play area or other access ways, parking structures, other things like that, that are part of the condominium and that they have the fractional share ownership of. The alternative, the other bucket, is the homeowners association or HOA bucket. And that an HOA is actually a legal entity. It's typically a nonprofit corporation, and each member of that entity is an owner of the residential real property located within the association's jurisdiction. And that jurisdiction is determined by a plat. So you have a plat that gets recorded with the county, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a bit. But the plat identifies the footprint of the community, identifies where the different lots are, and then all of the owners of those lots are members within the HOA. And by virtue of their membership or their ownership, they're obligated to do certain things. And those are outlined in the governing documents, which we'll talk about in a bit. But we're talking about paying taxes, paying insurance premiums, paying maintenance and repair costs for certain components within that plat, improvement of the plat if necessary. And so all of those owners within the plat are tied together under this one umbrella of the association, and they all share the operational costs and duties of that community. As we go through, a lot of times I'm going to share a little hot tip, and these are the things that kind of are a shortcut or something that's just super helpful for you to know, as depending on the topic we're talking about here. In terms of a condominium, the most efficient way to know, because sometimes it can be hard to determine, is there undivided fractional share ownership? Remember, that's the key term for a condominium, or is there not? Sometimes in HOAs, and I've seen it, maybe you've seen it, that in an HOA, you can have owners who have fractional share ownership of certain common areas. So that can get confusing. The way that we surefire know if it's a condo or an HOA is if there's a survey map and plans recorded for the community, it's a condominium. Every time. Survey map and plans is a condominium. A plat, on the other hand, is an HOA, or a plat community is oftentimes what the statute will call it. So if you're confused or lost and you just aren't sure and the documents aren't as clear as you would want, one of the surefire ways is look at what was recorded to create the community. Was it a survey map and plans? If so, it's a condo. Was it a plat? If so, it's an HOA. Okay, so now that we know what you're managing, if it's either an HOA or a condo, now we'll look real briefly at what statute governs that type of a community. I'm not going to get into too much detail so that your eyes roll back in your head, but I've given you a little bit of a chart here that maybe you could keep near your desk. And this helps with regard to condominiums. And the next slide will show with regard to HOAs. And the key for either is when the community was developed or created. And you know that because of the date of the declaration being recorded. Legally, that's when the community is established. So you can go look at the recording date for your covenants or your declaration. We'll talk about those in a bit. But if it's before July 1, 1990, and it's a condominium, then your community is likely governed by what we call the old act. It's RCW 6432, and that's formerly known as the Horizontal Property Regimes Act. It was created in 1963. It's really archaic and difficult to understand. It's limited in what it provides, not an optimal provision or a statute at all, but there are a lot of communities that are still governed by that statute. If you were created or your community was created in between July 1 of 1990 and 2018, then you're governed likely by the Condo Act, the Washington Condominium Act, RCW 64.34. And that's a much better statute, very far more detailed than the old act. And fortunately, we have a lot of case law interpreting this statute. So this is really the optimal condo statute in many ways right now in Washington. And that may change over time, but that's from my perspective, that's where we're at. And then if your condominium was developed after July 1, 2018, then you're governed by the Washington Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act, which is a mouthful, typically known as WCIOA, and that's RCW 6490. So in this chart that I've provided here, you can kind of see that there is some movement, there is some change as a new statute's adopted. There's certain provisions of that statute that will apply to older communities. And so it's important to know what provisions apply, and then look to your governing documents, because you can always amend your documents to bring in those provisions from an updated or newer statute. Then in the bullets down below, you're looking at incorporation. That's another set of statutes. So if your community is incorporated with the Secretary of State to create a formal nonprofit corporation, I would say the vast majority of communities do have corporations, but then they're going to be governed by either RCW 24.03A, which is the Washington Nonprofit Corporations Act, or by RCW 24.06, which is called the Nonprofit Miscellaneous and Mutual Corporations Act. This is far less common, and it's kind of a catch-all statute. Most communities are governed by 24.03A, but your community may be governed by 2406, and I'll talk a little later about how you determine that. You also have a number of federal statutes, of course, that apply. Obviously, the Constitution applies, provides for due process and other things in community associations. The Fair Housing Act applies and comes into play when we're talking about potential disabilities, comfort animals, those types of things. The Telecommunications Act applies when we're talking about the installation of satellite dishes, antennas, and other things. And then there's, of course, other federal statutes that would apply. And then there's other state statutes beyond those that I've talked about. The Landlord-Tenant Act, we've got municipal codes, your city codes, county codes that could apply as well. So there's a lot to take in, but generally you're going to want to know which community association statute. That's the key one to know, because that's going to provide quite a bit of guidance. So this is a similar slide that really just pertains to HOAs. In Washington, we only have two statutes that apply to HOAs potentially. One is the HOA Act, which came about in 1995 and is found under RCW 64.38. And then again, WCIOA, which took effect in July of 2018. And that's going to apply, that is the first statute in Washington that applies to all community associations at the same time. It's intended to cover condos, HOAs, co-ops, townhomes, all of it under the one statute. And it's far more broad. The challenge with WCIOA, as you've probably heard, is just that we haven't had enough time to really determine where some of the kinks are in the statute. There are kinks, there always are, and we just have to work some of those kinks out, whether they be through legal processes or changes by the legislature. And so that's why there's a number of, a lot of the attorneys in this field are reticent to recommend clients come under that statute if they're not a new community. But again, that's an entirely separate presentation that we could talk about for an hour. So, okay, so now we've talked about, is it a condo or an HOA? What statutes apply? Now we're going to move to the governing documents. And the governing documents really, in many ways, are the lifeblood of the community in terms of guidance for how this community is going to operate. I've said here on the slide that they really establish the unique fingerprint of every community. And so it's really important that you as a manager have your arms around all of the governing documents that are applicable to this community that you manage. I've set forth here the typical governing documents. And if you've done this for any time at all, you know that the names can change, the types of documents that apply to the community can change, but at the end of the day, you're going to have some variation of these documents here. And so the plat or the survey map and plans, as we've already talked a little bit about, the articles of incorporation, the declaration, which is also known as the covenants, the CC&Rs, the I've heard it called the rules and restrictions, a whole number of things that the declaration can go by, but probably the most common and what the statute uses is the declaration. The bylaws, the rules and regulations, or the house rules, the rules and regs. There's a lot of names that rules and regulations can go by. And then also sometimes you'll see collection policies, board resolutions, fine schedules just by themselves, design guidelines, and other documents like that. Again, they may take on a lot of different names, but this generally is the universe of governing documents you'll see for a community. So now what we'll do is just walk through each of these, and I'll just give kind of, again, a 10,000 foot level of what is the purpose of the document, who drafts it, can we amend it, and then maybe a hot tip about each document that you can walk away with. So the survey map and plans, or the plat, again, plat deals with HOA communities or pretty much anything that is not a condominium. Survey map and plans creates a condominium community. They're drafted by typically a surveyor that is working with the developer at the start of the community. This is like the first document that's created to establish the footprint of the community and show where it's located, where the units are located, where the common areas or common elements are. And this does get recorded with the county. So you can find this for every community, or you certainly should, and it will have a recording number. You can amend the document. That typically is either going to be guided by the statute, which talks about amendment of these documents, or it's going to be guided by the governing documents, specifically the declaration. We'll talk about how to amend a plat or survey map and plans. But usually that's done by the same process as amending the declaration itself. Then the purpose of this document, like I said, is really to just establish the footprint of the community and identify where the different areas are, where the open space areas are in in an HOA, where the different tracts are, the drainage fields or the retention ponds. In an HOA, it will show where the parking spaces are. I mean, excuse me, in a condo, it typically shows what the limited common element parking spaces or storage lockers or common element play areas, those kinds of things. And then in either document, plat or survey map and plans, you want to look for the notes. And the notes can be a really key part of the document. And for me and the managers I'm working with, oftentimes we've got to dig into these notes. And oftentimes you'll find that the notes are actually captured in the declaration themselves. But the notes usually reflect the agreements that the county or the city, whatever municipality oversees this community, the agreements that were made with the developer at the time of development. And so it'll talk about, for example, it'll say the association is to maintain and repair the drainage or the retention pond for tracts A and D. Those types of things. It just lays out, here's the things that the county or the city municipality is requiring of the developer and of the community going forward. And it's really important. A lot of times they'll have real specific notes. Lots 1, 7, and 12 cannot expand or encroach into this certain area. And you don't necessarily see that in the declaration, but more often than not, you'll see those very specific notes in right on the face of the plat or the survey map and plans. And that's really can be a helpful thing if you're navigating an issue relating to a certain tract or a certain lot or a certain unit. Okay, so the next governing document is the Articles of Incorporation. And these often you'll just hear these references, the articles. They are drafted usually by an agent for the declarant or the developer. This is right at the start of the community again, usually, and they're forming the nonprofit corporation by recording these, excuse me, by filing these articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. So these aren't recorded with the county, they're filed with the Secretary of State to establish the nonprofit corporation. And I should say, not every community is incorporated. It is typically strongly recommended that a community be incorporated. So if you get a community and you cannot find the articles and you cannot figure out if they're incorporated, it's really easy to do to determine, because the Secretary of State has an online database that you can go on and just search for the name of the community. Usually you can come up by just putting, if it's Canterbury Estates, and that's the name of the HOA sign right at the entrance to the community, you can go in usually and just put Canterbury Estates into this database, and they'll come up with, they'll let you know all the Canterburys or Canterbury Estates that are in the state that are incorporated, and you can try to find the one that's yours. If you cannot find it, that may mean that it is actually not incorporated, and that would begin a process whereby you would want to look and really determine whether it's prudent to do that. And talking to the association's legal counsel would be a great start. There are some significant protections that come, particularly for board members, by incorporating. So it's really an important thing to do. But again, another presentation entirely there. The articles can be amended, and typically statute outlines the process to do that, or the articles themselves typically will mirror the statute. But it's a vote of the owners, as we'll see a little later here. That's not something that the board can do unilaterally. Hot tip here is, it's incredible to me how often I see that the name, the actual formal legal name of the association that's incorporated with the Secretary of State, is actually not reflected in the covenants or declaration of the community or the bylaws. So the developer will incorporate the community, say, as the Canterbury Estates Homeowners Association, but then everything in the documents, in the declaration and the bylaws, just calls it the Canterbury Homeowners Association, and they leave out estates as just one example. The real formal legal name is what's recorded or filed with the Secretary of State. It's not what's in the governing documents. And so that's important if you're going and getting bank accounts or insurance or entering contracts. You want to make sure you know what that formal legal name is, and ultimately to amend the governing documents to make sure they properly reflect the legal name, because you don't want the documents to say one thing and the formal contracts and everything else to say something else. Okay, moving right along. Now we're into the declaration, which is really, as you will probably know, really the key, I would say the key document for every community, because this document is the document that gets recorded and binds, runs with every single unit or every single lot within the community. It's drafted typically by a developer's attorney during the course of the development of the community, which we'll talk about in a sec, can be very problematic. It's recorded with the county where the property is located, and so you can typically always find it under the online search for the county or with the county auditor. And it can be amended, but it's, again, not something that the board can do on its own. It has to be done by a vote of the owners, and usually the declaration will talk about what percentage of owner approval is required. This document really creates the guardrails in many ways for how this community is to operate. It sets forth the authority for the board, sets forth the rights and obligations of the owners, and it's going to give overall the things that the board and the community can and cannot do. It sets the tone. How restrictive will this community be? How much oversight, how much approval is required to modify something or to change something? All of that will be set forth typically in your declaration. Hot tip on this one is that where a developer's attorney has drafted the document, just like any good attorney, they're thinking about their client first. They're not thinking about the association's long-term health and viability. Yes, that's part of the calculus, but they're really thinking about their client. And so just about every set of governing documents, specifically declarations that are recorded by a declarant's attorney, is going to have a number of what we'll call poison pills that are inserted in there that protect the developer to the detriment of the association long term. And so once the owners take over, it's really prudent that the owners work with association legal counsel and with you to navigate and determine where those poison pills are. And specifically what they do is they short circuit the statute, and they will undercut or put hurdles in the way of the association exercising its rights, particularly to either sue the developer or to do the various things that the association has by statute the right to do. They'll put hurdles in the way of that so that the declarant or the developer is more protected legally. And so removing those things just gives the association and its members the full range of its rights that it has under statute. So really an important thing to look at once the owners take over in a newer community. Okay, bylaws. And I should say we've got a midterm coming up here. This is a 101 class. We're going to have a midterm here coming up shortly. So I hope you're all taking notes and are ready to respond here. Bylaws are the next in the hierarchy of documents, governing documents. Bylaws are going to set forth really the administrative operations of the association. Oftentimes we'll see bylaws do a lot more than that, but bylaws really are intended to set forth the administrative operations. How many people serve on the board? How do you hold meetings? What types of meetings are you required to hold? When do you hold them? How are they noticed? What's a quorum? What are the officers that serve the association? How are directors elected? All of the administrative operations should be set forth in these bylaws. And there really shouldn't be a whole lot of overlap between the bylaws and the declaration. A good set of declarations typically will identify how many directors, the fact that you're going to have meetings and annual and special meetings, maybe talk a little bit about notice. But in most of that, it's deferring to the bylaws, and then the bylaws have the meat with regard to the administrative operations. Typically, bylaws are not recorded. I do see it recorded a lot. I'm sure you all have seen bylaws recorded, but most often we saw that with older communities. Very rarely do we see new communities get their bylaws recorded. They can be amended, and oftentimes it can be done just by the board. There's nothing preventing the board from amending the bylaws unless the bylaws themselves require owner approval, in which case then obviously owners must approve to the required percentage set forth in the bylaws. And hot tip on this one is that it is incredible to me, and maybe you've seen this as well, how often the bylaws and the declaration are not in alignment on key provisions. I see a lot of nodding heads. It's amazing to me on something as simple as like the number of directors serving the community. That you won't have alignment in those two documents. Ultimately, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the declaration does trump. It does control there. And so you want to look at the declaration. But when you're dealing with the bylaws, you think that it should set forth everything administratively. And oftentimes it conflicts with the declaration on that. And so that can cause a lot of confusion. So if you identify that, that's something that is really prudent to address through an amendment process. Okay, next is the rules and regulations. So we're getting more and more specific in terms of the operations of the community here. We've gone with the declaration, which really deals with big picture authority and like I said, kind of the guardrails. The bylaws are administrative. Now, the rules and regulations are going to be very specific to your community. You could have a set of declarations for two communities that are almost identical because they're so filled with statutes and boilerplate. The rules could look entirely different for that community because they're really setting forth how is this community specifically going to implement the protections that are set forth in the covenants. In essence, how are we going to implement the protections on the guardrails that are established there? Rules and regulations. Just let's use one example: pets. So your declaration might say something as simple as owners are permitted to have regular household pets. You can't breed, you can't have poultry or livestock, period. End of provision. Your rules then might say you can have up to 2 household pets. They can't be more than 35 pounds, and set forth a fine procedure if you're not, cleaning up after your pet's waste. And outline the specifics as to what you can and can't do with that animal. Sometimes that'll be in the declaration, but most times those specifics you'll find in the rules and regulations. They're created by the board of directors, and state statute authorizes the board to mandate or to regulate those on their own, to amend them and do what they need to do to them without a vote of the owners. Sometimes rules will be amended by owners, and the board will require that or allow that. But state statute allows the board to do that on their own. They're not recorded. They're just kept with the association and then provided to the members. Typically, they don't take effect until the owners have 30 days notice of the adoption of these rules. Hot tip on this is that the rules really reflect the characteristics of your community. Like I said, provisions may supplement and clarify the provisions of other documents, but if they contradict the declaration, if they're more restrictive than the declaration will control, and those provisions within the rules are invalid because they exceed or contradict the declaration or state law. Okay, looking at potentially other documents, we'll just touch on these briefly because they're not applicable to every community. Design guidelines, oftentimes, particularly in larger communities, that I have a couple communities that are 2,000 or 3,000 lots, and oftentimes they'll have design guidelines that the ACC, or the Architectural Control Committee, or the Design Review Committee, whatever name your community has applied to that body is tasked with overseeing all modifications and all enforcement within the lots. And so these design guidelines give them a lot of specifics. Sometimes they can be 30 to 40 pages long, talking about basketball hoops and fences and stain colors and all that type of stuff is going to be provided in design guidelines. Collection policy is just going to set forth the specifics with regard to how the association's board will enforce delinquent assessments. And sometimes that's just the board will rely on the declaration, but oftentimes they'll create their own collection policy, which is just more detailed and outlines the kind of step-by-step process that the board will follow. Board resolutions is an interesting one in the sense that oftentimes we'll see boards create resolutions to demonstrate the actions they're going to take in either enforcement or in interpretation of governing documents. And the way I find board resolutions to be the most helpful is when the board identifies a specific area of the governing documents that maybe isn't as clear as it would need to be. And rather than amending the documents, they just create a resolution that indicates how they're going to interpret that and how they think future boards should interpret it. So there's some consistency there. But there's a lot of different reasons for board resolutions, and your association legal counsel can assist to let you know if that would be a prudent approach. The other way is, or the other document is a fine schedule and a hearing procedure. You cannot levy fines in an association unless you have a previously published fine schedule and you have a hearing procedure that's established to allow the owner the opportunity to come before the board or another body to let them know why they think the violation is wrong or why the fine is inappropriate or whatever actions being taken is being challenged. And that's standard due process that's provided by the US Constitution. The owner doesn't have to take you up on it, but you do have to provide those two things. So usually you'll find those in the rules and regulations, but if you don't, you can create your own separate document that's just a fine schedule and a hearing procedure and provide that to the owners, and that would essentially create the opportunity for the board to fine owners if needed as one way of enforcing the documents. Okay, so briefly, the hierarchy of documents, just for a recap, we've got statutes. Those are typically going to trump anything unless, and this is important, sometimes the document or the statute will refer to the documents and actually defer to them. They'll say, unless the declaration says otherwise, and then they'll provide the statutory provision. So it's important to go to the statute or to talk to legal counsel to find out, is this an instance where the governing documents control, or is this just a flat statute that applies and overrules anything that we have in our governing documents that might conflict? Then you have the plat or the survey map and plans, which we've talked about. Then you have the declaration, which is recorded, runs with the land. Then you have the articles of incorporation. Make sure that it's a filed version. Oftentimes, well, I wouldn't say oftentimes, occasionally we'll see an unfiled version that isn't active. It's not operational. The bylaws, you want to make sure you have a signed version that confirm that the board ultimately did approve this on a certain date. Rules and regulations, which again are overruled if they're in direct conflict with the other governing documents above them, but typically they may be signed, they may not be, they're not recorded, so typically there's no real markers that indicate they're approved. Design guidelines, board resolutions, collection policy, etc. And then, as I've noted here, 4 to 8 can be modified in terms of hierarchy based on the governing documents. Usually this is the standard here, but the most significant difference is bylaws and articles. Sometimes articles will control, sometimes bylaws will control, just depending on what's stated in the governing documents themselves. All right, I told you it was coming. Midterm exam, we've got 3 questions here. All right, so I don't know how we do this. If there's I'll look at my screen here. If I see somebody waving your hand, I'll call you out. Okay. All right, how do you know if you're managing a condominium? Come on, take a chance. Can't see some of you without a camera.
Look in their governing documents to see what they're clarified as.
Perfect. Who was that? I can't see. Amy.
Me.
Amy
Yeah.
Hilton. Thank you, Amy. Yes, look at the governing documents to see if they specifically say it. What's the hot tip if you can't figure it out in the governing documents? What was the hot tip I said that really is the clear designator of condo or HOA? Anybody remember?
Stephanie posted in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Let's look at the chat. Yeah, survey map and plans instead of a plat. Yeah, so if it's a survey map and plans, it's a condo. If it's a plat community, then it's an HOA. Great. Hold on. Okay, where can I find out if my community has articles of incorporation filed?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. Absolutely. Secretary of State's not with the county. You don't record it. You file it with the Secretary of State, Corporations Division specifically. Okay, so your community's declaration states the board shall consist of 5 directors. The bylaws state the board shall consist of no less than 3, no more than 7. The board currently has 3 directors and the annual meeting is coming up. How do you advise the board? What do we need here? We've got 5 the declaration says 5. bylaws say you can have no less than 3, no more than 7. And currently there's 3 directors serving and the annual meeting's coming up. What do we need to do here?
Vote for 2 more.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. We need 5, right? We're out of compliance with the declaration. The declaration controls over the bylaws. Even though 5 is within 3 to 7, we've got to comply with the declaration, which says 5. And so ultimately we can look at amending to give some flexibility there, but we want to make sure we're in compliance with the declaration. So good, thank you. Okay, now we're going to move to the board. The board really is the body that's responsible for acting for the association. So generally we've got a nonprofit corporation, and just like any nonprofit, they have a decision-making body that acts for the corporation. Typically, board is going to be appointed by the declarant during that declarant control period. They're then going to be elected by the members once the declarant passes off to the owners. Boards can either make decisions at a board meeting or they make decisions outside of the board meeting. Inside the board meeting is definitely the most appropriate and provides the deliberation and discussion that that the legislature contemplated when they created this structure. At a board meeting, it's usually by majority decision. But again, look at the bylaws. Typically, they'll tell how boards make decisions on certain topics. And then any board decision should be reflected in the meeting minutes themselves, which are then published to the owners. So if they weren't at the meeting, they can then determine what the board did or what happened at the annual meeting if it was a meeting of the members. If the community or if the board makes a decision outside the board meeting, because you do not have the opportunity to deliberate sitting in a room talking about it or sitting on a virtual chat talking about it, the decision must be unanimous. And so most common way these days would be email. So if I send something out to a board and I say, hey, here's a proposed draft of a letter that we want to send, or I recommend sending, let me know if the board approves. If the board doesn't go into a formal meeting, then the board's vote by email has to be unanimous. And then that decision has to be reflected in the next meeting minutes of the next board meeting. So that, again, that action is captured and reflected in the long-term history of the community. Here's a breakdown of the things that the board shall do according to state law, and then the things that the board absolutely cannot do unilaterally. And this list of the shalls really is not comprehensive at all. But these are the things that you take from statute that are kind of, again, the big picture things that the board is going to touch and the board's going to decide on: maintaining, repairing, and replacing common property, establishing and approving budgets, collecting assessments, paying expenses with those assessments, saving for reserves, consulting with experts if necessary, depending on the topic, procuring and maintaining insurance, and then governing the community, enforcing, interpreting documents, and establishing rules for the community. Again, by statute, and I've laid out the statutes there at the bottom of this second column, the board cannot unilaterally do these things. These are things that have to be done in conjunction with an owner vote. So amending the articles, to change the corporate structure anyway, taking action that requires the vote of the owners, which really is like amending governing documents, terminating the association, making decisions not to repair certain components or certain areas after, say, a fire, electing directors to serve on the board. The board can't unilaterally do that. Not to be mistaken with appointing directors, which the board can do. If there's an open spot, the board can fill a vacant spot on the board for the remainder of an open term, but they cannot elect directors on their own, or determine the qualifications, powers, duties, or terms of office. That's something that the membership has to be involved in. Not going to walk through this. This is, again, just a chart that's handy, walking through condos and HOAs. and then the statute that's applicable based on the slide that we looked at earlier, you can determine what's the standard of care that's set forth in the statute for your board of directors. And you'll notice as you read through them, they are different. Generally, the legislature recognizes we don't have professionals coming to serve on a board of directors. They might be professionals in another area, but they weren't elected typically because they're a professional board member. They're voluntold, or they're volunteered, or they volunteer themselves to come forward because they're willing to help. And maybe they have a day job that allows them to be a little bit more free than others, so they can get yelled at. Excuse me, they can help and do the things that they need to do to serve their community. But the legislature recognizes this is a low bar in terms of the standard that we're going to hold them to. And outside of things like gross negligence, criminal acts, things that are in direct contradiction to the law, standards typically are going to be low for a board member in terms of having personal liability. But the standards here, a reasonable, ordinary process, what a reasonably prudent person would do in similar circumstances, good faith. These are all things that you'll find in these statutes. Okay, so we talked about one of the things that the board really is tasked with. One of the primary things that the board does is enforcement of the governing documents. And this can take a lot of forms, as you probably know. Well, as you certainly know, your managers, you assist the board with doing this. But to properly enforce the governing documents, it's really important that you as a manager, and even more importantly, that the board knows what's in the documents and understands what's in the documents. And so one of the things that I do a lot of board member boot camps or things like that, where we're meeting with a board and just going over what are the things you need to know. And one of the things that board members find most helpful is a tip that they go through the documents, particularly for new. This is something you could recommend for new board members as they come on. Give them some homework and say, go through your governing documents with a highlighter and highlight every provision that says you shall do this, or the owners shall do this, or they must do this, or they may do this, because that outlines the things that are absolutely mandatory, the things that the board has to do or that the owners have to do. One example would be the owners shall submit a request for approval prior to any modification on their home. So they have to do it. And so the board can then have eyes out to see that anytime a modification is done without getting that approval, an owner has violated the governing documents and enforcement would be necessary. If they're rewriting documents, or if they're thinking about the rules and writing some rules, the things that they want to avoid really are the shoulds or the recommends, or the things that just have really soft language that leave us kind of tiptoeing around trying to figure out, am I supposed to do this? Am I not supposed to do this? Clarity is king, and words like shall and must and may give us a sense of where those guardrails are and where the boundaries are. And may, it is a little bit squishy, but it gives us the sense that this is optional. This can happen, or it's not. There's some discretion here. Sometimes the discretion's with the board, sometimes the discretion's with the owners. Just depends. In terms of enforcement, there's a number of different ways that enforcement can happen, and that's going to be guided typically by the governing documents. So usually associations have the right to bring a legal action for enforcement. That can be costly, and that can seem really excessive if it's something that's a lot smaller. So you may want something like self-help if an owner is not keeping up their lot or their unit, or if there's an emergency, the association board has the authority to go in and self-help to perform the work for the association, and then typically to charge that cost back to the owners. You can levy fines. Again, you have to have a published fine schedule, and you have to have an opportunity for a hearing in order for fines to be appropriate. But if you have those things, then you have the authority to levy fines according to that fine schedule. And then the hot tip here would be, in terms of any enforcement, look at the governing documents to make sure that there is a provision that provides for the recovery of attorney's fees for the prevailing party. This is a really important, I call it a hammer. That sounds excessive, but it's an important hammer that that your legal counsel will use to push the owner, if the owner's in non-compliance, to come into alignment and to recognize the costs could really go up significantly here if ultimately they do not follow through, because the association files suit and has the right to recover fees. The owner really has to weigh, boy, is this action really worth it? Am I really intent on staying in non-compliance here, knowing that this potential expense could hit me? If you don't have that, then it takes away a lot of the gravity that, you know, general counsel like me or even you, if you're writing an enforcement letter, can have. The other hot tip would be consistent. Make sure you're documenting enforcement. If you're sending violation notices, make sure there's a place where that's being captured, because if you have to get an attorney involved, it's helpful to have that historical reference to show, oh, there's been 3 or 4 violation notices sent. Here's the response back. And we can point to 2 or 3 other owners that have been treated exactly the same way that did something similar. That all really helps the association's position in terms of enforcement. Okay, looking quickly at budgets and assessments. So you create one of the roles of the board is enforcement. Another one is creating a budget. Obviously, your offices and you specifically are very helpful to the board in doing that. Once the board has a budget in front of it, the board then approves the budget and goes through this process. Now, this is a process that's outlined in Kiowa, took effect 4 years ago, and it is really important because it clarifies the process. Now, it's worth noting that it does not apply to certain communities, specifically condominium communities, that have contradicting language in their governing documents. So this can get a little confusing, and it's one of those things in Kiowa that we're still trying to navigate a little bit. But in essence, what the statute says is this budget ratification process is applicable to all plat communities. So if you have a plat community, again, an HOA community, then it supersedes any inconsistent provision of the governing documents relating to budgets or assessments. If you have a condo community, then RCW 6490, I believe it's 080 or 090, specifically says that the inconsistent provisions of the governing documents for a condo community are not invalidated. They remain in place. So the way that takes effect for a condo would be if a condo document says, for example, that you need 51% of the owners to approve an increase in assessments over 10% of the prior year. Based on the language of the statute, that provision in a condominium would likely apply. And you would have to go through that process to ensure that that is applicable and that procedure is followed. Otherwise, you go through this process here. No quorum is necessary. If a majority of the owners don't show up at the meeting to reject the budget, it's ratified and takes effect at the period when the board has confirmed it will, typically the start of the fiscal year. And that applies to both regular assessments and special assessment process. This is a list of the things by statute that have to be provided with the budget. Typically, it'd be incorporated into the budget. Sometimes it's a document your reserve consultant or reserve specialist will provide that accompanies the budget. And this is intended just to give clarity and transparency to the process for owners who are getting the document to really understand what kind of exposure do I have to a special assessment, how funded are we in our reserves, those types of things. Okay, association meetings. We're looking at something that was changed fairly significantly in July 2021. And it applies to all communities. So you're going to want to look at the statutes that relate to meetings, whether you're an HOA or a condo, and they may even override some of the provisions in your bylaws or your declaration relating to the meetings and what you can do. But generally, notice by statute is 14 to 50 days for just about everything at this point. And your notice states the time, date, and place, and the business on the agenda. Governing documents might include other things that need to be provided. They can be sent, the notice can be sent by personal delivery, public or private mail or delivery service, or by email if you've followed the process that's laid out in the statute, which in essence is the owner has to give consent to be notified by email. But if you have that, you can provide email notice at this point. The governing documents may restrict having meetings in another way other than in person, but because of the pandemic, we've seen a really expansive, here we are on Zoom having our meeting. We've seen expansive meeting by virtual methods or other methods that allow the owners to meet without being in the same room. And the statute allows that now unless it's expressly prohibited by the governing documents of a community. And then quorum is super important as well. And the governing documents typically are going to mandate this. They'll set forth the quorum percentage. But it's important to know that no business can be conducted at a meeting where the quorum is not present. That's meetings of members and meetings of the board. And so it's really important to know what the quorum is to confirm whether quorum is present. And then if not, you've got to adjourn the meeting and reconvene at a time when you can get quorum. Okay, and then voting is another thing that was really dramatically changed. Meetings, notice, and voting. I did a presentation about a year ago, maybe you were there, talking about some of the statutory changes. But in brief, what the new statute allows is voting at meetings or voting outside of a meeting, without a meeting. And I've set forth the applicable procedures or statutes that lay it out. Generally, there's conformance now, no matter if you're looking at the old act, the new act, the HOA Act, or Kiowa, there's conformance in large part as to how you can vote, whether it's at a meeting or outside of a meeting. And the outside of a meeting part is really, I have a lot of communities that are doing that these days for obvious reasons. And I'm excited about it, but it does put a number of other hurdles. The statute puts a lot of other hurdles in the way that just need to be complied with. So it's really important that you, depending on your community, you look at these statutory provisions that I've provided there next to voting without a meeting, just to make sure that you're checking the boxes and you're not going to come into a situation where you have a ballot vote and then ultimately it gets invalidated because of the fact that you didn't check every box during the process of holding a vote without a meeting. So that, my friends, was a fire hose of information that hopefully you were able to take in and found helpful. I am available for questions at this point. Michelle or Kim, how do you want to handle questions?
Yeah, I would think if you have questions, it'd be great to hear your voice. So go ahead and ask.
Tony, I see your hand up.
Awesome presentation, John.
Thanks, Tony.
Quick question. So we get this community and all of their governing documents say ABC Condominium Association, and then we go to the Secretary of State site and it says ABC Association of Apartment Owners. What do? Do we do nothing like everybody else has done for all these years since they've been around since 1979? Yeah. Or do we tackle tough conversations? Even the attorneys don't give, very consistent advice on this. What would you do?
Yeah. Well, I'm not really troubled with communities that have an association of apartment owners in it. To me, that's kind of a badge saying I'm really old condo. Because you're under the old act, and under the old act created again in 1963, condo units were called apartments. And obviously things have changed dramatically. That could create a ton of confusion. But for managers who've been doing this and attorneys who've been doing this, I don't get confused by that. That doesn't mean you don't have to answer a whole host of questions from owners. As to what I would do, the key thing I'd want to make sure is that the legal name of the association, as it's filed with the Secretary of State, is known by the board, known by the community, and reflected in the important documents of the community. So if the declaration doesn't identify the same name as the legal name filed with the Secretary of State, that's concerning to me only because it's possible that the board would go out and get insurance based on the name that's in the declaration. And that's not an entity that's a valid legal entity. Now, what an insurer does with that, I don't know. You know, if they can tie it to the formal legal name, so be it. But I'd be concerned about that side of things. I don't necessarily think we'd need to go through the hassle unless the board says they want to and they're up for it. I don't think we need to go through the hassle of amending the articles or amending the declaration specifically just to change that. I have done it before because boards have said this drives us crazy. We want the documents to be in alignment. But what I advise the boards is pay attention to the name that's filed with the Secretary of State. That's your legal name of your community. And for all actions you take, whether it's contracts or insurance or bank accounts, signing checks, putting the names on check, though, that's the name you want to use.
So we should also make sure that their IRS taxes are filed under that name.
Yes, exactly. It's important that that legal name is used because that's the legal entity. Now, I know that banks and others sometimes, you know, maybe show a lack of concern for those things, but as general counsel, and I would say as managers, those are the details we should be paying attention to and working to ensure are accurate and correct.
John, there was a question in the chat about the RCW for the unanimous decision through email.
Okay.
Can you speak to that? And
What is the RCW for the unanimous decision through email? I don't know it offhand. Believe it or not, I don't have those memorized. Let me see. I don't want to mess with the screen sharing and all that stuff. Trying to think, I could send it out by maybe I'll notify Michelle and you could send that out. There's definitely a statute. It's going to depend on the community. What type of community are we talking about? An HOA or a condo? Do you know?
I do not know, but I think you can also look to decisions through email through the for corporations as well. There's more than one place.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you want to go either into the Nonprofit Corporations Act 24.03A or into the statute that's applicable to your community, and you would look for actions without a meeting, and that's the heading typically that's under, and it's oftentimes it's going to be mirrored in the bylaws. I would say 90+% of the time you'll see a mirroring in the bylaws of the community, and it will say actions without a meeting. And that sets forth the statutory language that the board has to follow to make a decision outside of a meeting.
Thank you, John.
Uh-huh.
I don't see any other hands up. I really want to thank John for being here. Appreciate that. Good to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks, Kim.
Be well and hope to see you all next